kindred friends, and welcome to the Radical Emergence podcast, where we're having conversations at the edge of transformation. We are your hosts. I'm Dr. Jen Pierre-Rich, and with me is my friend, co-host, and co-collaborator, Dr. Sally Adnams Jones. Please check out our bios in the show notes where you'll find links to our work, websites, and can find ways to connect with us. If you're not already following, hit that subscribe button, ring that bell, and join our mailing list so you can stay up to date on new episodes as they drop.
Hello, everybody. Sally here. This exciting project consists of about 26 episodes in all, dedicated to better defining and understanding transformation on all its levels of reality. That's personal, social, as well as ecological. We're going to ask, what is transformation? Why bother? Why do we need it? And what does it feel like or look like? We'll also ask, can we induce it or perhaps accidentally block it? These are really important questions for growth.
We draw not only on our hard-won life experience, we are also trans-disciplinarians. So what the heck is that? Well, it means we want to understand transformation from as many lenses as possible, including formal academic disciplines and discourses, art, media, and popular culture. Importantly, we draw from our living experience.
So we are experts, so to speak, but mostly in just one small but highly critical area, our own suffering, and the medicines that we've both used to transform our own lives. So to this end, we've also added decades of committed practices, as well as formal degrees, including specific in-depth studies in the mechanisms of transformation, because we needed to understand this healing journey for ourselves.
Does this entitle us to help others? You bet. Absolutely. Because it is by sharing our stories, knowledge, and direct experience that we offer sane, sober, practical tools for living on the ground of life. So welcome. Strap in, hang on, and enjoy the ride as we deep dive into a universe of transformation. We are thrilled to be back with you on the Radical Emergence podcast, where we are having conversations on the edge of transformation. Hello, I'm Dr. Jen Pierre-Rich, and here with me, as always, is my beloved playmate in all things transformation, Dr. Sally Adnams Jones. Hi, Sally.
Hi, Jen. I'm so excited to be here again. I've missed you over Christmas, and here we are again.
Here we are again, doing what we do best, absolutely, and what we love the most. Well, we are talking about transformation on all levels of reality. That is what this podcast is all about. And one question that comes up again and again throughout these over 20 episodes is the inquiry, how do we know we're transforming? How do we measure our own transformation or the transformation of others or of society or of our relationship to nature and our animal kinfolk? And because we are a transdisciplinary show, we're going to look at this question from a variety of lenses, including the personal, the spiritual, the social, the ecological, the cosmological, and ethical, because we want to explore this along with other disciplines and wisdom traditions so that we can create a robust view of what transformation is all about. So today, our focus is going to be curating some ways we can measure growth, healing, and integration. What does it feel like and look like to grow and to heal and to transform? And how have theorists and creatives and researchers measured these aspects of our developmental journey? And it's really important to emphasize here at the start that there's no one size fits all measurement or metric for spiritual maturity, for conscious living, or enlightenment. And in fact, oftentimes these kind of external measurements can be really fraught with challenges and constraints and pitfalls that we need to be aware of. At the end of the day, I believe our truest measurement for transformation has to arise from within us. And that's because only we ourselves know our journey. We know what we've been through better than anyone else. So, and nobody can take our journey for us, or understand all of the unique variables, the contours, the context, the subtleties that have gone into shaping and creating our lives. And so much of our transformative journey depends on these very subtle behaviors and mindsets and circumstances. And because these variables are unique to each and every one of us, it's impossible to have any standard and apply it universally. That, in fact, can become a kind of oppression and disassociation from our journey. Because, at the end of the day, transformation is very subjective. What feels like dying can feel like rebirth to another person. What feels like a setback to me could feel like a comeback to you. So we're not suggesting one size fits all metric or method. We're just sharing an assortment of ways to interpret and quantify your own transformation and apply those interpretations to your journey as you see fit, because we trust that you are the one that knows best about what you need and how these measurements and metrics can work. And remember, as Sally and I always talk about, that we are individual fields of transformation, nested within holonic fields of transformation, which means that transformation is always happening. We can't get away from it. We can't stop it. We're always transforming and being transformed, and there's a current. There seems to be a flow of development that is pulling us forward through this transformative journey. And it's transforming us layer by layer. And the question we've proposed over on this podcast is, are you moving with transformation or are you moving against it? And so if we're moving with transformation, it's handy to have these tools to measure transformation, but also at the same time, not taking them so seriously, not always needing to quantify our lived experience. Is really about finding a balance between using the tools and not letting the tools use us. So we want you to take the knowledge and apply it in ways that feel natural and easy and intuitive for you. We're not here to sell you anything, pressure you in any direction or path. We're just opening our conversation about transformation in as many directions as possible so we can generate very dynamic perspectives. That's our goal here. That's what we're trying to do. So the application of these various measures, metrics, and methods and ways of quantifying our transformation are an important part of our conversation about transformation. So I just want to quickly touch on a few ways that we might measure our own personal transformation. And then later in the show, I'm going to look at how we might measure social and ecological transformation. And of course, Sally is going to take us on a wonderful deep dive into a variety of measures and wisdom traditions about conscious living and share why they are important for our journey. Because there are indicators that can help us understand and assess our transformative journey and our personal growth. And these indicators start to become obvious oftentimes when we start asking questions about our growth and healing. And a lot of times that's a very new and radical thing to even do for some of us. We really haven't even asked some questions about, are we moving into healthy, functional relationship with our ego, or is our sense of self driven by an unchecked ego? That's an important question. Are we moving towards growth and expanded awareness? Are we willing to be honest with ourselves and leave behind old ways of thinking and believing and being? Are we rigid and disassociated in certain ways about certain things? Are we more and more lighthearted and playful in our life? These questions are really important as we start considering how and where and why we're growing. And so, one really important way to assess our growth is by intentionally surrounding ourselves with a healing community, with people who are living and modeling the kind of life we want to live. And this can, just be in your daily life, but this can also be actively pursued in online communities. And the reason that a healing community provides an important metric is because we are around people, whenever we're around people who are really grounded and wise in whatever way we want to be grounded and wise, their behavior acts like a mirror that reflects our own behavior back to us, and it helps us see where we are and where we want to grow. And so if we're open within ourselves and in dialogue with our inner world, and we're actively engaged in self-awareness and self-reflection, then as our own unhealed and unconscious patterns start arising, and those behaviors are getting reflected back to us, we can sort of mine that information to see where we need to put our attention, and see where are those unhealed and unconscious patterns are, right? And we can move and grow in the direction of our wise friends and mentors and teachers and loved ones. And it's important to remember, because we're learning from each other all the time, and we're mimicking each other. We pick up on each other's behavior in the same way as our primate cousins do, because we're socially constructed beings. As social psychologist Kenneth Gergen would say, socially constructed, and simply by engaging with each other and modeling the behavior with each other that we want to share with people and that we want to learn and grow into, we're constructing new selves that are more engaged with where we're growing. We can see how we're growing and how we're not growing. And I know I stress again and again the importance of self-awareness and self-reflection, but you can see here why it's so very important to have this capacity and develop this capacity to be conscious and inwardly honest about our own unhealed patterns and shadows and behaviors. So to intentionally choose our community and seek out our mentors is a very radical act of healing, and it's a way to track our subtle and not so subtle evolution in our beliefs and attitudes. Very quickly, I want to say another way that we might want to measure our personal growth is when our sense of meaning starts to change and expand. We did an entire show about finding meaning in what philosopher and cognitive scientist John Vervaeke calls the meaning crisis. So I really want to recommend that you check out that show if you haven't seen it, because sometimes when we're not conscious with our own relationship with ourselves, meaning gets really hard to find, or maybe meaning feels like something that's outside of us or something that's artificial. And we lose our sense of purpose. And research shows again and again that having a sense of purpose is essential to living a long and happy life. Another way to measure our transformative growth is through our relationships. Are we healing within our relationships? Are we setting appropriate boundaries? Are we repeating harmful patterns of relating over and over again? Are we making trauma bonds, or are we making healing bonds? Are our conversations moving from constant miscommunication to more increasing communication, healthy communication? Do we have a variety of connections, both with our acquaintances and also synchronistic interactions with strangers, as well as deeper intimate connections with our beloveds? So asking ourselves these questions helps us recognize these patterns of development and the patterns within us that need to be addressed. And it comes down again to a willingness to be honest and real with ourselves, and welcome the opportunity to notice these patterns and move towards growth rather than moving away from growth. So I'm going to stop there. I've said a lot. I can't wait to hear from you, Sally, about how we can measure our growth, healing, and integration.
Thanks, Jen. That was a great intro. And you mentioned quite a few things there that I would love to pick up on. We've spent a year together with our listeners, and we've been exploring what transformation is. And today we're going to look at how it feels. Does it look like? How do you know that you're transforming? So we're going to dive into sort of the ways we can measure if it's working. Pretty much that's what we're talking about today. Change is change. And we know from this year together that it's universal, it's ubiquitous. We can't ever even stop it, even if we wanted to. So how do we work with it? And how do we know it's working? And just to say that we've mentioned before that the West tried to take this idea of transformation on board psychologically with therapy. In the East, and that's only been about 100 years, in the East, for about 3,000 years, they looked at this spiritually. And the interesting thing is they came up with different ways to measure how we transform. So in the West, we've got maps. We've mentioned spiral dynamics, for example, which is a map a lot of developmentalists look at that measure the changes in our values. We've got wonderful theorists like Suzanne Cook Greuter, who looks at how our ego develops as we mature. So there's different ways we measure if we're changing for the good. Values, ego dissolution, moving away from narcissism, embracing more and more until we embrace the whole thing and care about it. So what I'd like to just point out in this little section is these approaches are very different. And I want to look at that a little bit more. So in the West, it's about developing the self. We spoke about this last week. And in the East, it's about merging the self with the whole. These are very different. So we don't want to ever pretend they're the same thing and they're not going in the same direction, but we need both. So for example, therapy, traditionally for the past 100 years, started out just looking at pathology. And all it was doing was moving us from unwellness, dysfunction, to being able to live a nice, normal life that's functional. And then after a couple of years, they started saying, well, that's not great. That's about not being well. Let's now start looking at well-being and positive psychology. That was great. But this is about how to live a functional life with good relationships. And this is essential. But it's not the focus of enlightenment teachings, which move you from being a normal functional being to an ecstatic being. That's very different. That's a whole different journey. And what that requires is that you really start working and mastering your mind. So that's different from therapy. And as we've discussed, you can have fully enlightened beings on the planet who are full of pathologies and shadow. And we've discussed that. We've lost count of the number of gurus who can teach how to move into ecstatic states, and they've never done a day of therapy in their life, and they abuse their communities. So these are two pathways, both of which are essential. So when we come to metrics, or how do we measure them, we have to have different lenses. So the one is about how functional are we in society, our relationships, how emotionally and socially intelligent are we? And enlightenment teachings are more about how are we moving into ecstatic states. And the reason we do that is that once you've tasted some of these states, you begin to change dramatically. There's no going back. And those things are evident. They're becoming more and more evident as you do your therapy and as you do your meditation. We'll just call it a meditation practice for now. There's lots of ways you can enter spiritual practice, chanting, prayer, but so let's just therapeutic practice, meditative practice. They take us in different ways, grow up and wake up. And those have different measurements. So there's plenty of monks who are fully awake who would not function well in the middle of a city, and they have no family, and they wouldn't be able to be fully functioning in a massive, busy community. They have their own little isolated community. So these are different skills, and we need both. So, for example, I just wanted to mention one of my favorite writers, Georg Feuerstein, who wrote the wonderful encyclopedia called The Yoga Tradition. It's a big fat book, one of my favorites. He's looked at all the literature that's ever been written. He's an Indologist, so he studied all the books in Sanskrit, and he collated this information. And therapy takes us into a fully functioning waking state. Feuerstein tells us that if you look at the literature on enlightenment, there's 15 further stages that can be explored. And he goes into a description of each of them before we're fully awake. So that's a kind of a practice that is specialized. It's a meditative practice. And the reason we do that, as we've said before, is you begin to taste oneness. You move beyond your ego. The ego dissolves, and you start to really embrace the whole cosmos as part of you. Therapy doesn't take you there. Therapy takes you to embracing your family and your neighborhood and your loved ones. So if you can see, there's different metrics, and they're both important. Therapy takes us into a well-rounded human that functions well in society. And enlightenment takes us into the bigger embrace of the whole quantum picture. So we need both. And in the next section, I will go into more detail of how you can tell you're beginning to change with both of these practices. I'm going to give it back to Jen for now and see what she would like to talk about social transformation.
Sally, I think we just maybe coined a term right here on the show. We can call it functional oneness, and how important it is to have this kind of balance in our life where we can be functional and yet at the same time, have fingers and toes in the mystic and the magical and the spiritual and the cosmic, and yet equally grounded in our communities and with our people, and like you're saying. So I love this functional oneness. I think I may put that on a t-shirt. So Radical Emergence Podcast, celebrating functional oneness. That's so great. I would love to talk about some ways that we might measure the transformation of our communities and our societies and maybe even the world. I think most of us would agree that our world is transforming incredibly fast and faster than ever. And part of that has to do with the radical development of technology and how technology is applied and so often misapplied and used and so often misused. And we've had tremendous transformation in terms of healthcare, and equally a lot of damage from healthcare, from big pharma, for example, and a system of medicine that profits from sickness rather than health, right? So do more people have access to healthcare and dental care, mental health care? Do more people have access to affordable, healthy, organic, unprocessed foods? Or are there more and more food deserts with only access to cheap, easy, ultra processed foods? So there's a lot of questions here about how we can measure the wellness of our society and how we are transforming. And there's also, needs to be said, a lot of very critical factors of social injustice and inequality that have to be considered when we talk about social transformation, like the matrix of oppression and racism and white privilege, white supremacy, white nationalism, the theft and displacement of indigenous and Black traditions, lands, and food. As a queer person, I'm very interested and supportive of LGBTQIA rights. I'm very trauma informed. I'm very concerned about the prison industrial complex, unchecked capitalism, mass consumerism, fast food, fast fashion, the animal industrial complex, and gender inequality, patriarchy, and intergenerational trauma. These are all injustices that we have to look at when we're measuring the wellness of our society. Are these injustices on the rise, or are they in decline? And so elections also in politics, both local and national, are another way to measure the wellness of our society and where it is growing or where it's not growing. And I've said again and again that the current politics in the US and the policies have been very effective at opening eyes to the actual measure of wellness in our country. Does the narrative about American exceptionalism hold water when we actually examine the wellness of our nation? And in many ways it does, and in many ways it does not. And we really have so much opportunity, so much promise, and so much potential, and yet so much of that is squandered with an unsustainable business as usual approach to our problems. So I want to share really quickly a quote that you've probably heard before. And it says, the ultimate moral test of any government is the way it treats three groups of its citizens. First, those in the dawn of life, our children. Second, those in the shadows of life, our needy, sick, and handicapped. And third, those in the twilight of life, our elders, our elderly. End quote. And so interestingly, this quote is, or something to the effect of this quote, is often misattributed to Gandhi, but it was actually said by Hubert Humphrey in an address to the Democratic National Convention in New York City in 1976. And he was speaking about the treatment of the most vulnerable members of our society as a reflection of our government. And I want to give a wholehearted amen, hallelujah to that. Because how we are treating our children and our most vulnerable peoples, I would include animals in nature in that, and our elders. I really believe that how we can measure our wellness and growth as a society is how we're treating each other. And there's been a lot of progress, right? I mean, nobody's saying that we haven't made strides, and we can see that we've made progress, but there's also been a lot of steps backwards. And there seems to be this kind of swinging back and forth pendulum between what Dabrowski called disintegration and integration, right? Where we have to have this kind of breakdown in order to have a breakthrough. And that is actually very similar to what many of us have experienced in our own personal journey. So it's interesting to reflect on that, the fractal holonic interconnections again between our inner and outer worlds, and how they're reflecting each other all the time. You know, our inner worlds are often reflecting what is happening in society, and what is happening on an ecological level as well. And remembering that how when we heal ourselves, we are also healing our community, we're healing our society, we're healing our neighborhoods, and we're healing our world. And I believe the development of inner peace and healing and inner compassion and a desire to be of service are developing deeper understandings and connection, being trauma informed and trauma aware, embracing nuance and complexity, and certainly humility and forgiveness are excellent measures of personal and social growth. So with that, I'm going to pass it back to Sally, and I can't wait to grow deeper with you.
Yeah, Jen, I think you mentioned probably one of the most critical metrics, and that is the expansion of care. So we owe that to a wonderful woman called Carol Gilligan, who decided that was one of the metrics for adult development or enlightenment, is moving beyond the narcissistic care of just the self to care of the family, care of the community, and as you're saying, all the vulnerable, actually moving into service as a way to alleviate suffering. That is definitely one of the metrics all the great masters have mentioned. So it's not just what books have I read, what concepts do I understand, how many maps can I talk about ad nauseum. It's actually, what are you doing? Have you translated this into action and participation for the alleviation of suffering? So Houston Smith was a wonderful man who wrote about comparative religions, and he said the goal of spiritual life is not only altered states, it's altered traits. So how much of us is actually changing beyond narcissistic self-involvement? Are we moving beyond thinking we're enlightened because we have a high IQ? Are we actually developing high EQ and SQ, which is emotional and social intelligence, as Jen was saying? If these things are not evident, you have some distance to go as a mature adult. So those are so important, Jen. One of the things I'd like to stress, seeing as you're talking about social participation as a sign of maturity, is last week we spoke about dual citizenship. So this is an important factor in meta-modern enlightenment, that you don't just sit on your cushion, you're fully involved. And I was thinking about how many great teachers have said this. There was the Buddhist two truths, that there's relative truth and absolute truth. So there's the unique person, and then there's the oneness of the universal truth. So the two truths. Christianity spoke about being in this world fully, but not of it. So the two ways of being, the dual citizenship. I mentioned last week a Hindu teacher, Baba Haridas, one of my teachers, who spoke about the fact that there's two things to do in this life. You fully engage with life and you transcend it. And the indigenous cultures, they spoke about two-eyed seeing. I love that. So this is the binary Jen and I always talk about. We live fully in duality, and we also get the ecstatic tastes of non-duality. That's why we would meditate, so that we really feel that we're part of these two realities. And the more we taste the oneness, the more our identity changes, and we realize that we are actually allowing flow through us into the world, that is our service, that as we open up and become more and more, as Jen said, construct aware, which is that most of our thoughts are just constructions. We start working with our minds and become more and more aware of awareness. And that's what starts driving our behavior, the awareness of what needs to be done. And we start to co-create with evolution. That's a very different place from being a narcissistic go-getter who's just self-involved and wants to accumulate resources. So that's a major metrics for whether we're developing or not. So basically, I want to just mention a couple more things that we can look at in each other and ourselves to see if they're happening. We mentioned flow, and Jung spoke about the fact that synchronicities start to happen as we move into flow, that there's a lot more awareness that there's meaning. Jen mentioned meaning, that we start to have ego dissolution, as we mentioned. We start to feel that our embrace of the whole universe is what we're moving towards, not just our own ego. And this is a shift in identity. And I spoke about Barbara Marx Hubbard last week, saying that we actually then begin to identify with evolution itself. It's a big shift from identifying only as Sally or Jen to little nodes of awareness operating for the benefit of evolution itself and for the whole of life. That's a massive shift. And then our behaviors change. So if the behavior is not evident, we're not quite there yet, because we actually have to engage fully in the world and not just sit around reading books or meditating, although those are also essential. So we're able to integrate paradoxes, and we've mentioned this every single episode, that's one of the greatest metrics of all is, are we aware of this dual identity? Can we function really well in the world? Can we really access non-dual states? They start to feed each other. Eventually, they move from the binary to the duality, to the paradox, to the unity. And that's what Jen and I have spoken about, that we call integral Taoism. It's a movement from the two being fully available for both the two-ness and the oneness at the same time. So lastly, I would say personally, one of the other important measures is your life starts to simplify. And you get an ability to savor beauty and sensual gifts that we have, hearing, sight, touch, sound. They become very, very rich, and our life becomes more meaningful with less. So that's another metric, is that we can get more and more pleasure from less and less. And I would say we also start to really open up our chakras, we develop our voice, we start to make a stand on things. As Jen said, we become justice aware, we become trauma aware, we become really aware of the other and their needs. And then we start to act on that. So we really embody the psychological shift into a behavioral shift. I'd love to hear more, Jen.
I could listen to you all day long. I mean, yes, the joy and privilege of being in duality and non-duality, and also using simplicity and slowing down as a metric of growth and healing. And that has too been consistent in my life, that the more full I am on the inside, the less I need things, people, status, because it's that fullness inside that's driving me instead of a sense of emptiness. So it's so important, Sally, and I just learned from you so much when we're in these conversations, and I know everybody listening is learning from you too. Thank you. So I and Sally wonder and worry a lot about our relationship with nature as humans. The way we treat nature has always been a thorn in my heart. It's something that keeps me awake at night. And it brings a lot of anxiety to me. And so a natural development on my journey was that I devoted my master's work to eco-psychology, which is the study of our human relationship with nature and our animal kinfolk, and how we got so disassociated and separate from nature. And my thesis research showed that our relationship with nature is fractured in a variety of ways, but all of those ways can be traced back to what Sally said in the very beginning, our identity, our sense of self that feels isolated and so disconnected from nature. So do we have a sense of self that is aligned and interconnected with nature? Do we feel that? Or does our sense of self feel separate from nature? And if our sense of self is defined by separation from nature, why worry about caring for it? Right? But if our sense of self is feeling, that we are a one with nature and our animal kinfolk, well, then that's something worth fighting for, because it's not like we have to, help nature and poor nature. It's like, no, that's me. That's me showing up for me, right? I'm making this decision for our interconnectedness, right? Rather than because I need to come in as a savior and fix everything. I'm showing up as nature to support nature and advocate for nature. So you know, there there is a lot of opportunity to explore how we are developing and growing by looking at our relationship with nature, um, and trying to reawaken our natural biophilia, our love of nature, our love of animals, and our earth home by assessing and reimagining and reintegrating and reorienting our entire sense of self to be deeply interconnected within that wheel of our living earth home. I believe that that is our pathway out of a lot of the messes that we face as a species. So in this last section, I just want to highlight some way that we might measure our connections, our connection of self with nature. How do we measure the development of an ecologically grounded self and ecological consciousness? Is there a way to measure that connection with nature and the feelings that are arising when we're in nature? So there's this very interesting article that is near and dear to my heart from 2011 by eco-psychology educator Peter White, and it's called A Phenomenological Self-Inquiry into Ecological Consciousness. And I'm going to read this from the abstract. So Peter White writes, this article explores the heightened state of ecological consciousness from a phenomenological self-study perspective. A structured mindfulness-based perception exercise was developed to deepen nature connectedness and evoke a heightened ecological consciousness within natural settings, end quote. So what White did in this study was he asked the participants to carve out some quiet, uninterrupted time to engage in these connecting activities, what he called nature connection sessions. And it's important to say here that you don't have to be out even outside. If you are physically impaired, you can do this exercise in front of a window, just looking outside too. So he asked the participants of this study to do this connecting activities. So this is a quote from his article. He says, quote, the aim of this activity is to empathically engage a particular object or landscape feature, either using one or more of your senses. Allow a sense of deep appreciation and or love for the subject to arise naturally while maintaining an extended breathing rhythm. So just breathing. Engage in an imaginary dialogue with the landscape or nature being. Hug it, touch it if possible, or visualize an interaction that might elicit a connecting, sharing experience. This activity cannot be rushed and will normally take around 20 to 40 minutes to complete, depending on one's capacity to maintain mindful connection. Be receptive and open to your emotions, thoughts, and insights that arise. Record all interactivities without becoming attached to anyone. Be patient, open, and observant to the experience. It is often subtle, yet profound, end quote. So when the participants were done with this connecting activity, they were asked to reflect on these 16 thematic categories that White had identified as characteristics of connecting with nature and a heightened sense of ecological consciousness. So here are the themes. So the first one is a sense of reverence or humility, a sense of relationship, ecological awareness, being, a sense of place, ecological sense of self, restorative or therapeutic feelings, spiritual meaning, a sense of vulnerability, a sense of wildness, appreciation of non-human otherness, oneness and communion, perceptual acuity, solitude, mindfulness, and finally, openness. And so, reflecting on these themes of connection from our own points of view, doing a self study like this, that's what he means by a phenomenological point of view, that helps us recognize how, why, and when we are engaging in generative healing relationships within nature. There's an increasing sense of mindfulness, right? Where we're not just going out into nature and just being like, oh, heal me, but no, we're like really being mindful and intentional here. And we're looking at these themes in order to connect. Oh, what am I feeling here? And when I do this exercise, I actually feel many of these things, not just one. And so this is a way to measure our development of an ecological self and ecological consciousness. So from the article, David White writes, and this is just so beautiful, I love this part. He says, in my discoveries of self and others in the wilds of eco-consciousness, I have stumbled upon, as if for the first time, the spiritual depths that lie in the everyday sights and sounds of habitual surface perception and normal waking consciousness. These depths have provided a richer, nuanced dimensionality, not only to the physical world around me, but to the inner world within. I have experienced an ecological sense of self and self, that's with the capital S, and come to understand their interdependence with heightened states of ecological consciousness. He goes on to say, prior to my immersive research experiences with natural landscapes and with the beings of non-human nature, I did not fully understand that to some very substantive degree, I had been lost for so much of my life amongst the surface of my perceived reality and entranced by the pleasures and pains of my controlling ego self. Indeed, I had not realized how completely lost I was, how much I needed to find my bearings in life until I arrived at the end of this research and learned what my mindful, immersive experiences within nature had taught me about the infinite extent of my relations. Isn't that beautiful? So I want to invite you to create your own self-study where you go out and have a meaningful engagement with nature and reflect on what it feels like to be you in nature. What are you receiving? What are you giving? And by identifying those feelings, we're shown where we need to put our attention in order to heal and grow. And that's the development of self-awareness. That's the development of ecological self and ecological consciousness. And Sally and I are going to put a link to White's article in the show notes. But the takeaway here is to create your own immersive self-study as a way to measure your own direct connection with nature. Make time to go look out a window or or go outside and reflect on these themes of connection and start to gently notice, if you can identify how you're transforming and growing as an ecological being. And give thanks to our earth home and give your love to our oceans and offer your compassion to our animal kinfolk and thank them all for our growth, because it's that kind of a participatory connection that I believe and that White believes and that Sally believes that is going to lead to a more sane and stable relationship with our earth home, which includes what we buy and what we eat. So I believe that sanity and sustainability starts from within, from doing this healing work within our own selves. Because when we nurture that sanity and stability, it inevitably is going to transform our relationships with ourselves and with each other, with our earth home, with our animal kinfolk, in very powerful, positive, unexpected, and transformative ways. So we hope what we share on this show is helpful for you. Sally and I are hopeful that pointing to these measurements and markers and points and feeling tones that tend to arise on the developmental map We hope that pointing them out is helpful for you, but we also want to remind you that the map is not the terrain, the actual ground of your life where transformation is always happening. That ground is providing really important information and insight, a grokking insight that these measurements and metrics may not or cannot provide. So I believe it's really important to use the tools, but not get lost in using them. And that's a part of growing into spiritual maturity, is the capacity to discern when to use a tool and when to put that tool down. So it's been a real delight to share our time together, and I'm going to end it here and say goodbye. Thank you for your attention and for your own healing that you are cultivating within yourself. It's a gift to all of us. It's a gift to your own self and to your family lines. I wish you well, and I look forward to seeing you again as we make our way to these last few episodes of the Radical Emergence podcast. Back to you, Sally.
Yeah, Jen, I think you just mentioned two of the most critical features of mature adult development, and that is ethics and morality, which extend beyond the self to our community, to our full environment. That's probably one of the major metrics. And mindfulness, the mindfulness connection. So I want to expand a little bit on mindfulness as a way of ending. So back to our little theme of the West felt we should develop our minds and rational thought and imagination and creativity. And so we value study and developing our capacity to use our mind. That, the early romantics felt that that's what separated us from so-called animal kinfolk, is that we have this mind. So we should love it and develop it. That's the Western value. The Eastern value is mindfulness, which is a little different. It means that our mind becomes one with the things we focus on. Jen mentioned attention and focus. What we focus on and what we connect to is part of our mindfulness practice. So these are two very different ways. In fact, the Eastern tradition suggests that we drop out of our minds completely every now and again. So the relationship we have with our mind is critical. So we use it actively. That was the Western way. We engage the mind, and the Eastern way is drop out of the mind, find this background state. So it's like, let the clouds disappear and you will see this bright blue sky behind it, which is the ecstasy that the Eastern traditions always talk about. So the relationship to the mind is everything. We use it and we also drop out of it. And this is the paradox. This is the great skill at the center of the awareness of awareness and where we're using and putting our mind and its attention. Because our attention is what everybody is trying to grab. The media, our children, our spouse, the marketing, the noise, they want our attention. And so mastering attention is everything. And it's our freedom. So I wanted to just end with two extracts from I've made, I haven't hidden the fact that I'm a yogi and have been for decades. So I'm going to draw on two wonderful texts from the East. One is the Yoga Sutras from Patanjali. It's a central core text for training the mind. It's all about training the mind. And there's a commentary in there by a wonderful man, Swami Satchitananda. And he says this: as the mind, so the man. Bondage or liberation are in your mind. If you feel bound, you are bound. If you feel liberated, you are liberated. And things outside neither bind nor liberate you. Only your attitude toward them does. So the practice of yoga is all about watching the mind, developing that strength and capacity to be a master of where you place your attention. So he gives the example of prisoners in a prison and the wardens who are in the prison 24/7 with the prisoners. The prisoners feel imprisoned, whereas the wardens do not feel imprisoned, and yet they're in the same building 24/7. So our attitude to our life is really what imprisons us. And I would give the example of someone like Nelson Mandela, who was imprisoned 27 years, mostly doing hard labor, often in solitary confinement. And he came out preaching forgiveness and tolerance and acceptance and inclusion for even his torturers and the people that denied him a vote or even his dignity for his whole life. So it's how we approach our circumstances. Eventually, self-mastery has nothing to do with our circumstances. But the paradox is we have to care about our circumstances and show up for them. So the last thing I'd like to end this week is a reading from the Bhagavad Gita, which is a Hindu sacred text, the core sacred Hindu text. It's a beautiful description of really the resilience and peace of mind we get if we do practice meditation and why we would do it. So we've said we do our therapy, we do our activism, we do our engagement, and we also do our meditation. And this is why. So it's Bhagavad Gita chapter 6, verse 19 onwards. When meditation is mastered, the mind is unwavering, like the flame of a lamp in a windless place. In the still mind, in the depths of meditation, the self, capital S, reveals itself. Beholding the self by means of the self, an aspirant knows the joy and peace of complete fulfillment. And having attained that abiding joy beyond the senses, revealed in a still mind, they never swerve from the eternal truth. They desire nothing else and cannot be shaken by the heaviest burden of sorrow. The practice of meditation frees one from all affliction. Abiding joy comes to those who still the mind. Freeing themselves from the taint of self-will, with their consciousness unified, they become one with the absolute. The infinite joy of touching the absolute is easily attained by those who are free from the burden of evil and have established within themselves. They see the self in every creature, that's what Jen was saying, and all creation in the self. With consciousness unified through meditation, they see everything with an equal eye. That's what we were calling cosmic consciousness. Seeing all life as my manifestation, they are never separated from me. They worship me, this is the absolute speaking, in the hearts of all, and all their action proceeds from me, the oneness. When a person responds to the joys and sorrows of others as if they were his own, he has attained the highest state of spiritual union. So in other words, that last sentence, if we see everything as ourself, that's the highest attainment. Those were literally listing off the metrics of a highly developed, mature adult. And that is ancient, ancient scripture from India, and such a beautiful, beautiful text. It moves me to tears. So that is how we become resilient. That's what we're really interested in, how we become fully functional and fully liberated at the same time. And it's mostly by watching our mind and what we do with it. So we're looking forward to being with you again. We've only got 3 more episodes left. And Jen and I have really enjoyed this year, and we're sad it's coming to an end, but we've got a couple more episodes. So please join us again. And until next time, Witness yourselves, look at your own metrics, and see how you're doing with transformation. So thanks for joining us. And we hope you can take away some helpful tools, perhaps some great stories, and some wisdom for your own ongoing journey.
Join us for our next episode, where we will deep dive again into a universe of transformation.